don't worry about oh yes, you will need your vocab notebook, so go ahead and get out your vocab notebook should already be out. But if you have not yet, go ahead and open to a new clean page. Well, no, don't open to a new clean page. We'll add these to the end of the chapter 7, chapter 4, lesson 2 notes. So draw a squiggly line underneath the last word, which was revolution. And then we're going to write read a timeline. Oops, that's 2 words, not 1. Timeline is 2 words. And then the date, February 10th, 2021. Then you may put your pencil down and open your book to page 122. Yes.
Are we numbering?
Yes.
So we'll start on number 8?
No, we'll still start on number 1. It's just going to be, sometimes there's only like 1 or 2 words. And there's only 3 today, so I just don't want to take up a whole new page. Although I guess some of you probably will anyway because of space, but oh well. Okay, so everybody should be on page 122. We're going to talk about reading a timeline. Now this should go quickly because the other day I had you read a timeline and most of you did it like that. Yes, Mason. No, we're going to start with number 1. It's just because these are short. So I didn't want it, there's only 3 words. Sometimes there's only 1 in these skills lessons, so I don't want to take like a whole page for like 1 or 2 words. Okay, so we will start with number 1 instead of number 8, which is a little different, but we only have 3 words. So. Okay, so on page 122, it's okay, take a breath, 122, 122. Please read first, Kingston. Loud and slow. Oh, you're not ready. Lena, loud and slow on page 122. Everybody ready to follow along with your finger? Go ahead and read the title first.
Read a timeline. Why it matters. Knowing the order of events and the amount of time between them can help you understand how events are connected.
So, remember when we first started lesson 2, there was a timeline up at the top and we read it and we figured out what those 3 important events were. If you want to look back at it, keep your hand there. But you can look back at page 116 and we had that timeline at the top and we read about those 3 important events. And then we also used this timeline to figure out how much time had passed between the 13 colonies declaring independence and England agreeing with it and naming the United States a new country. How did we do that? What operation did we do to figure out how much time had passed between those 2 years? Colin? Subtraction. Now remember, the minuend is the larger number in a subtraction problem. Was the minuend 1776 or 1783? Which one did we start with? Ethan? Louder. 1783, because it's the bigger number. And then we subtracted the earlier year from it, 1776, to figure out how many years went by between America declaring, or the colonies declaring independence and being an official new country. How many years passed? We said 1783 minus 1776, and it equaled what, Cullen?
7 years.
7 years. So how long, now that we know about the American Revolution, how long did the American Revolution last? Lena?
7 years.
7 years. Really a little more, so I think they rounded up to 8 years because of when in those years the things happened. But yeah, 7, 8 years. So let's go back And let's read about a timeline. What is a timeline? Michaela, read that first paragraph. Under learn. You don't have to read learn.
A timeline can show events that took place during one day of month,
Nope, not 1 day of month.
1 day, 1 month, 1 year, 1 decade, or larger,
Not larger
or longer.
or
A
longer.
decade is
Oh, pause, because we had a vocab word. What's our first vocab word for this skills lesson, Michaela?
timeline.
Timeline. It is 2 words, not 1. Like the mistake I made. And what is a timeline? Well, a timeline, I will start the definition for you, Michaela. A timeline is a diagram. Remember, diagrams are just pictures that give us information, and there are different types of diagrams. This is one type of diagram. So, Michaela, it's a diagram that does what?
That shows events when they take place.
Well, read what does the book say? That shows events
That took place during 1 day, 1 year, 1 decade or longer.
that took place during 1 day. What comes next, Michaela?
One month,
1 month,
1 year,
1 year,
1 decade or longer.
1 decade, or longer. Michaela, when you're done writing that definition, go ahead and keep reading. Make sure that your camera is tilted so I can see you and what you're working on. Thank you. There you go. Everybody ready to follow along with her finger once you're finished writing the definition?
A decade is a period of 10 years.
What's our next word, Michaela?
Decade.
Decade. And what is a decade?
Decade is a period of 10 years.
A period of 10 years. So when you talk about the 90s, that's a decade. 1990 to 1999 was a decade. If you talk about the 2000s, well, that was a decade. 2000 to 2009. If you talk about the 2010s, that was a decade. 2010 to 2019. If you talk about the 80s, that was a decade. 1980 to 1989. They're all 10 years. Because even though you're like, but wait, it only goes to 1989. Why would it not go to 1990? Well, think. 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989. How many years is that? Class?
10.
10. Even though you're like, but it ends at 9. Well, because 1980 ends with a 0, but it's the first year. We wouldn't put the 1980 as part of the 70s, would we? And say that the 80s were from 1981 to 1990, would we?
No.
No, because 1990 is part of the 90s. 1980 is part of the 80s. 1970 is part of the 70s, and so on. Michaela, finish out that paragraph.
On a timeline, the earliest date is at the far left. The latest date is at the far right.
So if we look at this timeline down at the bottom, The earliest date is what happened first. The earliest date we see on this timeline is the year 1601. But what was the earliest event on this timeline? 1601 is the earliest date, but not the first event, not the earliest event. What was the earliest event? Smith.
In 1610.
And what happened in 1610?
Henry Hudson explores the northeast coast.
So, 1601 is the first date we see. Does everybody see 1601? That just tells us here's where our timeline begins. But the first event didn't happen for about 9 years until 1610 when Henry Hudson explored the northeast coast. Now the latest date is the one that's most recent. What is the latest date that appears on this timeline? Aaron. 1901. That means everything on this timeline happened between 1601 and 1901. Sorry, 1901. Now 1901 is the latest year, the most recent year, most recent date. But what was the most recent event on this timeline? Mason?
1783.
What happened in 1783?
The American Revolutionary ends. The United States becomes a country.
So even though the most recent date was 1901, the most recent event on this timeline was in 1783 when the American Revolution ended and the United States became a country. Normally, a timeline will not include that much time where nothing happens. But I think in this case, they're just trying to show us that this, what we're going to talk about in the next paragraph is what they're showing us. Okay, read next. Aaron, loud and slow.
This timeline shows events in the early history of the Northeast. The space between each mark stands for 1 century, or a period of 100 years.
What's our next word, Aaron?
Century.
Century. And what is a century?
A period of 100 years.
A period of 100 years. So a decade only includes 10 years, like the 90s. The 1990s was a decade. The century includes 100 years. So when we say the 1900s, we mean from 1900, the year 1900, 1900, to 1999, 1999. If we say the 1800s, we mean the year 1800, 1800, to 1899, 1899. We say the 1700s, we mean the year 1700, 1700, to 1799, 1799. Those are called centuries. We're going to talk a little more about centuries in a minute. Oops, Aaron, sorry. Finish out that paragraph when you're ready.
The first part of the timeline shows events that happened during the 17th century. From 1601 to...
When you see that, you say the first number, which is, what's the first 2 digits? What number do the first digits make? First 17, and then if you have 00 at the end, you just say 100. So what is that year?
the 1700s.
It's not the 1700s. Read from that dash. From?
From 1601 to 1700.
Good.
What centuries the last 2 parts of the timeline show?
So, this is where it gets a little confusing because it says the 17th century. I'm going to erase this. You don't have to write this. But I want you to see what I'm saying. it says that the 17th century went from 16, except really it went from 1600 to 1699. They made, I don't know why they did that, because the 17th century was from 1600 to 1699. That's weird. Well, it's because the first century, was the first year after Jesus died, the year 100? What was the year that Jesus was born? I'm sorry. What do we call that year? Mason? That's the time of year, but what do we call that year? Was it 100? Smith?
BC.
Well, that was before. The first century went from the year 1 to the year 99. The second century went from the year 100 to 199. Even though there's a 2, it's the second century, it's the year 100 to the year 199. That's why when we get to later centuries, like the 17th century, it doesn't start at 1700, it starts at 1600. So anytime you're reading a century, like the 17th century, the first 2 digits are actually the number before. So the 17th century actually started in 1600. So think of that. When? That means the 19th century started in what year? If we follow that rule, we know it's the 19th century. But what year did it start in? If the 17th century started in 1600, then the 19th century started in, Michaela?
The 1800s.
Not the 1800s. That's the name of the century, or that's part of it. So it did not, what year did it start in? Not the 1800s, but the year?
The year 1800.
The year 1800. And ended in what year, Michaela?
The 18.
Not the. We don't say the 2021. But the year 18 follows a pattern.
1890.
Not 1890, because what about 1891, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99? Were they in the next century?
No.
So what year did this 19th century end in? Michaela?
The year 1900.
Not 1900. Zari?
1899.
1899. Do you see, Michaela? They're all ending in the same first 2 digits, but 99. So that means the 18th century started in what year? Zadie?
It started in
What?
It started in 17th.
How can the 18th century start in the 17th century? They're 2 different centuries. Follow the pattern. If the 17th century started in 1600, the 19th century started in 1800, then the 18th century started in 17? The year 17? Can't hear you.
17.
You're getting very quiet at the end.
1700.
1700 and ended in the year. Follow the pattern.
I know it's 1799.
1799. You guys keep trying to add the before. We're not adding the. 18th century is another name for the 1700s. 19th century is another name for the 1800s. 17th century is another name for the 1600s. So we don't say the 1600. That would be like saying it is the year the 2021. Do we do that? No. So you don't need to add the before the year. But you do need to add the before the century, the 17th century, or the 1600s. They're the same thing. Even though these two numbers are different, it's because of that year 0 or 1 through 99. That's the only reason. Okay, so now let's look at this timeline. What is the first century, not year, shown on this timeline? Smith.
The 17th century.
The 17th century. Which century does this timeline not have any events for? Which century does this timeline not show any events for? Mason? The 19th century, because we see from 1801 to 1899, or 1901, there's nothing happening. It's just there to show you this is the 19th century. How many centuries are shown on this timeline? Zadie? 3. We have the 17th century first, then we have the 18th century, then we have the 19th century. What century did this year happen in? The year 1492. What century did this year happen in? Cullen.
The 13th century.
Look at it. We have 1600 happening in the 17th century. So that means 1400 happened in the
15th century.
15th century. What century did the year 809 happen in? Kingston? The 9th century. Basically, if it's a 2-digit year, it happened in the 1st century. If it is a 1 or 2-digit year, it happened in the 1st century no matter what. If it's a 3-digit number, date, if it's a 3-digit year, we add 1 to the first digit, and that's the century. So 809, the year, happened in the 9th century. If it's a 4-digit year, we add 1 to the first 2 digits, and that's the century. So if it happened in the year 1492, we add 1 to the first 2 digits, 14, to get the 15th century. Let's do 2 more of these, and I'm going to pick sticks. And then we'll do the questions on page 123 about this timeline. Then you'll have the rest of time to do your independent practice. If I pick you and you already picked one, so basically Kingston and Cullen, if I pick your stick, I'm going to pick somebody else's because you already got to do one, okay? The year 1296. Aaron, what century did that happen in? The 13th century, because it's 4 digits. The first 2 digits are 12. If the year is 4 digits, we add 1 to the first 2 digits, which would mean the 13th century. The year 48. Lena, what century did that happen in?
That happened in
How many digits is it?
2.
If it's 2 digits or 1 digit, what century did it happen in? Doesn't matter what those digits are. If the year is 1 or 2 digits, it happened in the Mason, can you help her out?
the 5th century?
Not the 5th. Zadie, can you help them out?
The 1st century.
The 1st century. Remember, if the year has 1 or 2 digits in it, it happened in the 1st century because the 1st century is the year 1 to the year 99. So that means 1 or 2 digit years happen in the 1st century. If it's 3 digits, you add 1 to the first digit to get the century. If the year has 4 digits, you add 1 to the first 2 digits to get the century. So this year, 1066. Carla, what century did the year 1066 happen in?
It is the 11th century.
The 11th century. We have 4 digits. We add 1 to the first 2. 10 plus 1 is 11. So it's in the 11th century. What about the year 438? That's me. Ethan, what century did the year 438 happen in? How many digits is it? How many digits is that year? 3, which means we do what? Do we add 1 to the first digit? Do we add 1 to the first 2 digits? Or did it happen in the 1st century? The 1st century is only the year 1 to 99. Did this happen between the year 1 and the year 99? If it's 1 or 2 digits, see, this is what happens when you're not listening when other people are answering. Remember, if it happened in the 1st century, that means the year only has 1 or 2 digits. If the year has 3 digits, we add 1 to the first digit to get the century. If the year has 4 digits, we add 1 to the first 2 digits to get the century. So this has 3 digits. What century did it happen in? Do we add 1 to the first digit or to the first 2 digits? So what century did it happen in? What's the first digit, Ethan? If we add 1 to that, what do we get? So what century did the year 438 happen in? I can't hear you. Who can help him out? Zari.
500s.
Not the 500s. The 500s is the year 500 to 599. Does the year 438 come between the year 500 and the year 599?
No.
Zari, pay attention. The 17th century is the 1600s because the 17th century happens between 1600 and 1699. The 19th century is the 1800s because the 19th century happened from the year 1800 to the year 1899. So, that means 438 did not happen in the 500s. It happened in the Carla.
400th century.
Smith.
The 5th century.
The 5th century. Please listen. If you had been listening and following along, you would have understood we never said 1000s, 1200s, 800s, 1500s. You would have noticed that when I was asking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions, every single time we said blank century, blank century, blank century, blank century, blank century, blank century. So that means I was looking for an answer that was blank century. The only time we talked about this was back here. So again, Carla, the year 438 happened in which century? The 5th. Zari, the year 438 happened in which century?
5th.
Loudly, please.
5th.
The 5th. Ethan, the year 438 happened in which century? The 5th. Okay, now we're going to use the timeline on the bottom of page 122 and 123 to answer the questions on page 123. I'm going to pick 6. So number 1, when did Puritans establish the Massachusetts colony? Smith.
In 1620.
In 1620. What century was that, Smith?
The 17th century.
The 17th century. Now I want you to notice, is the black dot on the timeline? The black dot above or next to 1620, is that the dot that's on the timeline? Class?
No.
No. Follow the line to which dot? Lena?
The red dot.
The red dot. Now that's going to be really important, especially on your independent practice. There are sometimes 2 dots. You need to find the dot that's on the timeline to figure out where exactly to put something. Okay, number 2, Kingston. Which English colonies in the Northeast were formed in 1664? Loudly.
New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island.
New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. Does everybody see where Smith and Kingston found their answers? Make sure you see it. You can put your finger on it. Number 3, in what year did the United States become a country? Zadie.
1783.
1783. What year did they declare independence? Michaela.
In 1776.
In 1776, they declared independence. Were they officially a country, though? What happened first before they were able to officially become a country? What is the specific name of what happened? Mason. The Revolutionary War, which you might also hear as the American Revolution. It's 2 names for the same war. Okay, so now what you're going to do is you're going to have independent practice. Girls at home, go ahead and get out that independent practice. This is very easy to make silly mistakes on. It is not difficult. There is a bit of writing because you do have to rewrite all these sentences. But it is not difficult to find where to write the sentences if you're paying attention. When I'm talking and when you're working. When I say pay attention, I don't just mean when I'm talking, I also mean when you're working. So, on the front, we have a whole bunch of events. Does everybody see that? You're not doing anything on this side. Other than, I guess, when you're finished with one, you can cross it out if you want to. On the back, you have a blank timeline. You have to fill in the blanks with these events. How many blanks are there? How many blanks are there? Victoria.
There's 10 in all, but 1.
What? So how many? Oh, there's how many blanks?
There is. Okay, so there are 11 in all, but 1 is already filled.
So there are okay, I worded the question wrong. Victoria, you're right. There are 11 spaces on this timeline. Do you see? But 1 is already filled in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1 is already filled in. One of those 11 is already filled in. How many events are on this list? Mason. Smith?
11.
11. 11. So, what does that mean? Are there any being left out? Are there any that you have to find on your own? Carla?
No.
No.
There is going to be 10.
There are spaces for every single event. Which event have we already used? Or did the book already do for us? Zari?
They did 1775 for us. The American Revolution began.
So which one can you go ahead and cross out because you don't have to figure out where it goes?
17. Wait, no.
Who can help her out? Smith?
1775, the American Revolution began.
There you go. So go ahead and you can cross that one out. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8th one. You can cross it out to show you don't have to find where it goes. The rest of them, you are figuring out where they go on the timeline. Should you pay attention to this tiny little dot next to the lines, where that one is? Which dot should you pay attention to make sure you're putting it in the right spot? Kingston. The big black dot that's on this timeline. So, what goes in this very first spot? So we're looking at these dark colored dots. We see the one at the very top. What goes on that blank? Colin. What goes on this very first blank, which we see it matches with the very first black dot?
Do you want me to say that?
Yep, I want you to tell me the whole thing.
The number and the sentence.
The date and the event.
Oh.
What goes on that very first black dot? At the very top, closest to the year 1600.
1609.
And what happened?
Explorer Henry Hudson sailed along the northeast coast.
So some of you are going to have to practice your very nice, neat, small handwriting. If you would like to sharpen your pencil to get a very sharp pencil for this, I will let you. Practice your very small, neat handwriting. Okay? If you have to go a little bit under the line, that's okay. Now, which space will the very last event go in? Put your finger on it and hold it up so I can see. Do not look around you. That's cheating. Where will the very last, the most recent event go? Which blank? Put your finger on it. Put your finger on the blank, not the dot. Don't look around you. Put your finger on the blank, not the dot. Because the dot is very close to another. Put it on the blank, the lines, not the dot. When I nod at you, you are correct. You are ready to begin. I can't see it. It's facing that direction. Smith? Mm-hmm. Michaela? Mm-hmm. Zari? Mm-hmm. Carla? Mm-hmm. So pay attention to where the black dots are on the timeline. Any questions? If you don't have questions, you may go ahead. If you do, I will answer individually.